That is the sort of thing we do. And if you want to know what other things that are happening in the not too distant future, there was a newsletter as you come in and will be available to you as you're leaving this space. If you need to find our bathrooms, you really need to earn it, because you got to go downstairs, and the bathrooms are even further to the back of the building, maybe sort of underneath the choir stall here. So they're way at the back, and there is some signage downstairs. We are so pleased to partner with the History Department of Nipissing University on their lecture series. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Professor April James from Nipissing University, who's going to in turn introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a larger card here in front of me. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the 12th Annual Anne Clendinning Memorial Lecture. My name is April James. I'm a faculty member at Nipissing University and a colleague of Kirsten Greer, our organizer of this evening's event. Over the last few days, Kirsten has been hosting our guest speaker, Ken Steacy, here in town. I've had the chance to spend some time with both of them yesterday, and we've been very excited to host him and talk about future projects together. Kirsten is a little under the weather, so I'm acting as a stand-in tonight to introduce our guest speaker. But first, I would like to thank Trinity United Church for co-hosting this event with the history program at Nipissing. We value opportunities to foster relationships across North Bay and the region, and we're proud to contribute to the Trinity Food Shelf program, which helps unhoused people, especially those without a North Bay address, access food. This event means a great deal to us, not just because it honors Anne Clendinning, who was a brilliant historian and a cherished colleague, but because it gives us a chance to invite distinguished speakers like award-winning comic book artist Ken Steacy to contribute to our university community. Ken and Kirsten met in the most serendipitous way. Kirsten was helping her brother with a Montreal Expo event at Ottawa Comic-Con last year. You know, the famous pop culture fan convention that showcases artists and products from all sorts of entertainment genres in all its forms, including comic books. And Ken happened to be seated right beside her. They started chatting, and she quickly realized that she was sitting beside someone whose work had shaped generations of comic book fans. People kept approaching his table requesting custom covers: Iron Man, Wolverine, Batman, Spawn. It was like watching a living archive of pop culture unfold in real time. Naturally, she did what any curious scholar would do. She researched him. That's when she came across a cover from the Captain Canuck series featuring the superhero Guardian set against an Arctic landscape, complete with a Cold War radar station and a CF-100 jet. That image hit close to home. As many of you know, we have our own history with CF-100s here in North Bay, tied to NORAD and the vast continental network of radar stations that once stretched across northern Canada, just like the one depicted in Steacy's cover. When she asked Ken about it, he told her his father, a Royal Canadian Air Force pilot, flew Voodoos with the 409 Squadron at CFB Comox, a supersonic jet fighter that also shares a connection to North Bay. But he added that his father had spent more time flying CF-100 Canucks, or clunks, as the pilots called them, than he did in Voodoos. Suddenly, Ken's comics weren't just comics. They became entry points into memory, place, and the way we tell stories about the past through visual storytelling. What started as a chance encounter at Comic-Con has since grown into a collaborative and interdisciplinary research project exploring the unintended environmental legacies of Cold War infrastructure, such as the remnants we see or we live alongside here in North Bay. Over the past few days, we've visited several of these sites, including CF-100 at Lee Park, the Voodoo across from the airport, and the old Beaumark missile site on Highway 11. Ken's career in visual storytelling spans over 5 decades as a writer, artist, art director, editor, and publisher. He has chronicled the adventures of characters like Astro Boy, Iron Man, Harry Potter, and the Star Wars universe. In addition to producing his own original work, he has collaborated with major figures such as Douglas Copeland, Harlan Ellison, and Trina Robbins. Together with Margaret Atwood, he co-created War Bears, a graphic novel that tells the bittersweet story of the rise and fall of a fictional Canadian comic book publisher during World War II. That story has since been optioned for a broadcast series. Ken is the recipient of both an Eisner Award and an Inkpot Award, and in 2009, he was inducted into the Joe Shuster Canadian Comic Book Hall of Fame, a lifetime achievement honor recognizing his contributions to the industry. From 2012 to 2021, he taught in the Comics and Graphic Novels program at Camosun College in Victoria, BC, a program he co-created with his wife, award-winning visual storyteller Joan Steacy. As the son of an RCAF fighter pilot, Ken is currently working on a graphic novel exploring the often invisible subculture of military brats. He also devotes his time to philanthropy. For many years, he has participated in Desert Bus for Hope, an online fundraiser for Child's Play, a charity that supports children in hospitals worldwide. Through his involvement, Ken has helped raise over $400,000 US dollars for the organization. It's no wonder that he's earned the nickname Ken Value Added Steacy. Tonight, in support of Trinity's Food Shelf, Ken will be doing a live sketch of our very own local Shadfly superhero, Shad-Man, a piece that will contribute to Trinity's fundraising efforts. Please join me in welcoming Ken Steacy and his presentation, Edutainment, Visual Storytelling in Service of Education, Instruction, and Advocacy.
Am I mic'd? Am I on? Hello?
Does he need this mic?
Do I need this mic? Can you check my... This is so embarrassing. Am I good?
Okay, the mute is off.
Okay, hello. Test. Can everyone hear me here? Because I think that's more for the streaming, isn't it? That you
won't be heard on the streaming unless you...
Great. Thanks, Ted. And thank you all for being here. And thanks very much to April and Kirsten and Nipissing University. And also, again, to the community and congregation here at Trinity. It's an honor to be here, and I greatly appreciate you all taking time. Gosh, where to start? I love to draw. I always drew. I think most of us did, and I think it was Picasso who once said, we're all born artists. The trick is to stay one as we get older. And there we go. Happily, I had parents who never tried to dissuade me from what was a very atypical career path for a military brat. I decided when I was 11 years old that this is what I was going to do for a living. The reason being that Stan Lee, who co-created the Marvel Universe, published credits. And when I was a kid, I remember reading these comics and going, Stan Lee, writer, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, and I realized that they must be somebody's dad. My dad flew fighter planes, somebody's dad drew comics, therefore that's a job, and that's a job that I could do. So the rest was easy, mostly. So about 8 years later, the magic moment occurred. I went to the New York Comic Convention in 1974. I banged on Stan Lee's door, and he said, who let this kid in here? Go talk to the art director, John Romita. And I was offered work as an inker. And what some people don't know is back in the day, comics were produced, it was like an assembly line, because very few people could do everything. This has changed dramatically, but back in the day, you were a specialist. You were a writer, a penciler, an inker, a letterer, a colorist, and that was that. So I went home and thought about this, and I had another epiphany, and that was that wanting something and having it are very different things. And I realized I didn't want to go to New York, and I didn't want to be a specialist. I've always been a big show-off. I like to take all the credit for what I do or accept all the blame. And so I determined that what I really needed to do was to go back to school, unlearn bad habits, and hopefully learn some good ones. And which is what I did. And fate stepped in the most wonderful, serendipitous way that the very first day of art college, and this was at Sheridan College in Oakville, I met my wonderful wife, Joan, and we've been together ever since. And that was 1974. So from there, we both went to the Ontario College of Art, which is now the university, studied for 3 years there, and the whole time I was freelancing. And that was really exciting because my profs understood what I was doing, and they allowed me to do projects that were actually being published at the time. So from there, my career just sort of took off. I actually got the superheroes out of my system pretty quickly. I loved Iron Man. He was my favorite character because, you know, we didn't have to be bitten by some radioactive creature in order to gain his superpowers. That he was just a smart guy who, you know, made these wonderful suits of armor and so on. So I arrived at an interesting time in publishing too, because prior to that, comics had all been printed on pulp paper using mechanical color separations. So they were often off register, and the color wasn't very saturated. But one of my biggest influences were British comics, Eagle magazine. And these were published in full color. So they were color separated, and the color was beautiful. And as soon as I saw that, I thought, that's for me. So I learned how to do that, so that when Marvel and DC and the other publishers started doing full color comics, I was uniquely positioned to take advantage of that. So I will be showing you examples of that. What we'll be doing, I will be talking about me, my absolute favorite subject, because I know it so well. And then we'll get on to edutainment, which is, to me, one of the most fascinating aspects of visual storytelling. Visual storytelling is simply that wonderful synergy you get when words and pictures work together, okay? And my wife and I, you know, as April mentioned, we were educators for 9 years. We had a program, and in that program, one of the assignments the students had as they created their comics was to do an edutainment comic. So it would be a comic in which they talked about some aspect of their lives or society or culture or, you know, whatever they wanted, that were entertaining comics in service of education, advocacy, or instruction. So I'll be showing examples of that as well. And then we'll finish that. If anybody has any questions, I can't imagine. I'm such a good speaker. I just like, people go, wow, what more is there to add? And then after that, hopefully Shad-Man, I hear is buzzing around, so might make an appearance, and I'll be doing a live sketch, and then we'll be, I guess, auctioning that off, and the proceeds, no, we're not gonna be doing that? Because I can't afford it. Well, somehow we're gonna use it as a fundraiser for the food bank. I also, I have a few prints left from the comic convention that I will have available at the back. They're very reasonably priced. And hopefully you'll find that of interest as well. All right, so I'm going to head to the back. So if you could all sort of keep your eyes on the monitor up front, you'll hear my voice. And then once that's done, I'll come back up. We can do the Q&A, and then I'll go back to the back. Or actually, we could probably move the card tables up the front and do that up there. Okay, does that all sound good? Excellent. Okay, here I go. Am I using this mic or? Yeah. Okay. Not to worry. Okay, what you see is 11-year-old Ken, and this is when I determined I was going to draw comic books for the rest of my life. Of course, I wish I had those comic books today, because if I did, I wouldn't have a mortgage. I'm not one of those people whose mom threw their comic books out. In fact, when we were transferred to Germany in my teens, my dad gave me a wonderful gift, and that was he had custom wooden crates made to keep my comics safe for the 5 years that they would be in storage. Let's see if this works. Oh, there we go. So you can see how nerdy I was. I actually built all my favorite Marvel characters out of Lego. And this is, you can see how limited the color range was back then. We didn't know it at the time, but my wife and I were into cosplay back in the early 70s. So this is for one of the Halloween parties at OCA. I'm also an official war artist. I've worked in the National War Museum in Ottawa, and it was a great thrill for me to be given the assignment to cover the peacetime activities of navigators in the Royal Canadian Air Force. When my dad, who was a fighter pilot, found out, he said, quote, who the heck cares about navigators? So I apologize to any navigators here. But this is me looking, well, truth be told, I was terrified. I was just about to break the sound barrier in the back seat of the aforementioned Voodoo, and boy, was that a thrill. And this is one of the paintings that I produced as part of the program. So here's an early attempt to draw comics. This isn't the one that I showed John Romita that got me the job, by the way. So here's my Spider-Man comic. I hadn't quite figured out typography yet, so it looks like it says, The Spider Amazing Man. And some more, you know, I'm starting to figure it out. That's an Aesop fable on the left, a public service comic on the right, done in, I guess these were done in junior high. And this is actually the sample that I did that got me the work at Marvel as an inker. And then, but later, while I was at college, I actually, my professional career started in '74. The first time I got paid to draw comics. And honestly, folks, to this day, I do a drawing and somebody gives me money, it's like, pinch me, I'm dreaming. It's still like so wonderful to be able to do that. So did a lot of comics. Yeah, some of you may remember underground comics. So there were mainstream comics, underground comics, and in the 70s, a new genre appeared, which are loosely referred to as ground level comics. In other words, they were comics that weren't either mainstream or underground. And I did a lot of those, including any chance I could get to draw aircraft, I would jump at. And this is one of the first comics where I did everything. I wrote it, penciled it, inked it, colored it, and so on. And by the way, the thing about writing, I love to tell the story that the reason I started writing, beg your pardon, the reason I started writing was because I was being given scripts that I wasn't wild about, and I said to my editor one day, I could write stuff this bad. And he said, sure, go ahead. So that's what got me writing, and so I got to draw whatever I wanted to. And they were that bad, by the way. So I worked for DC, I did Batman and Manhunter, what was that, Doom Patrol, Doom Force, etc. I did a lot of Iron Man, and this is one of the first, you can see here, these are typical of comics that were done using the flat hand-separated color that we all know and love. And then this is the full color. This artwork is all full color, painted in watercolor. Same with this. So then we had kids, and one of the great joys of having kids is sharing the kind of media that they love, which included lots of cartoons, and our favorite was Astro Boy by Osamu Tezuka. So when the opportunity to draw the Astro Boy comic came along, I jumped at it. So I wrote and illustrated the Astro Boy comic book for, I think it was 16 issues. But I was also still doing lots of full color comics, science fiction comics. This is a series I did called Tempest Fugitive, which again was just my excuse to draw 200 pages of cool airplanes. One of the things, this is one of DC's first creator-owned books. When you work for a comic company, they give you a page rate, you might get royalties, and you keep your originals, which you can then sell. But they realized that there was value in having creators own their own work. So this is one of the very first books that DC Comics did that was creator-owned book. And I own it, and once they had published it a few years later, I requested the reversion of the rights, sold it to another publisher. I almost sold it to EA Games as a game, and to this day I own it. So if there's any producers out there who would like to make a feature film out of this, talk to me after the talk. So we're going to be getting into edutainment comics, and these are just some examples of some of the work I did for various organizations. This is fun. Each one of these 3 images is a 3-foot by 6-foot panel at the Space Place Gallery in the TELUS World of Science in Calgary, and no, sorry, Edmonton. And when they printed them, they were printed on literally bulletproof material. And when I asked why it had to be so sturdy, they said, because the first middle school class that shows up will try to carve their names into them. So they have to be indestructible. So I also did storyboards for animated cartoons, album jackets. I imagine there's a few people here who remember Triumph. See, I do. That was a fun thing about the talk I gave this afternoon at Nipissing, was most of the students were younger, and when we taught at Camosun, I would often make what I thought were clever, ironic references to pop culture things, and they would go, huh? And then they would get even with me, of course, by doing the same, while I would go, huh? So I did Harry Potter, trading cards, did Turtles, more Astro Boy, Ghostbusters, Xena. So I did a lot of Star Wars work. I'm an official Star Wars artist. And what's really cool is when you work for Lucasfilm, George Lucas actually has rights of first refusal on buying the original artwork. And this is one he bought. He usually doesn't buy them, but on this one, I did that for episode 1. And I still kind of like Jar Jar Binks. I mean, I know, nobody, he gets no respect at all. Oh, poor Jar Jar. Yeah. So it was actually great because this paid for our honeymoon. Joan and I were married in '79, and it was 20 years later, because we were starving students at the time, 20 years later, George bought this and a couple of other originals, and we took off to the south of France. It was great. So thank you, George. Thank you, Jar Jar Binks, for our honeymoon. Again, I did a fair amount of Star Wars work. This is a fun one. It was for Dark Horse Comics, and they said, we need 8 covers for this comic series we're doing, but we can only afford enough for 1 cover. Can you do 1 cover and we can cut it in 8 pieces? And they said, sure. So that's what they did. So each one of those is a comic book cover. You got to be flexible when you're a freelancer. So still did a lot of advertising, local. I did, oh gosh, here's, what's his name? Indiana Jones. Did stuff for Pacific Opera. This is a fun one I did for Lucasfilm where I did a portrait of Darth Vader and one of Anakin Skywalker, and then I digitally transitioned them so you can actually see him go to the dark side. By the way, a quick word about tools. The digital tools are still just that. I've always considered them exactly the same as a pen or a pencil. It's just, you know, the person who is wielding them makes the art, makes the difference, tells the story. You use them when appropriate, and you avoid them when not. So, and again, I can't say I prefer one. Actually, no, that's true, not true. I do prefer traditional tools over digital tools. There is a wonderful, anybody here who paints or draws, I think appreciates that there is a wonderful visceral response when you drag, you know, a brush load with pigment across a surface, and they will never be able to replicate that. So, but like I say, I mean, this was a pencil drawing that I brought into Photoshop and then colored digitally. This is the same. This is a marker drawing that was colored digitally. That's Vancouver in the future. Here's Toronto in the future. I mean, they look like that already. I mean, But the work I do, it's always content appropriate. So when I do something like fun like this, I do very cartoony. When I do stuff like that Jar Jar Binks illustration, it's much more realistic. And same with, Marvel Comics, superheroes, you want them to look super heroic and nice and shiny and glitzy. And as a freelancer, I took on all kinds of interesting jobs. I love this one because these little rubber figurines were bound into the spine of the book, so whenever you open it, they would be sitting floating there, so that each illustration had to be designed with that in mind, which was a wonderful challenge. So, yeah, Mars Attacks. So Jello Man is, I'm not sure if that's the height or the depths of my career. Some genius at General Foods thought it'd be a great idea to leverage the whole superhero thing, and they made these molds that kids could buy, and they would make like the word Jello and make a character of it and then eat it, which I always thought was kind of creepy, but anyway. Their budget was fabulous, but apparently when they focus tested with kids, they said, this is the stupidest thing we've ever seen. And I think somebody actually lost their job over this because it was so poorly considered. Every now and again, somebody loves to troll me by asking me to sign a copy. So if anyone has one here. Anyway, so yeah, lots of, and you see the one on the left, that's a painting, that's an acrylic painting, so sometimes I get really, I wanted to sort of invoke a Saturday Evening Post cover. The one on the right, I was telling the students this afternoon, the importance of respecting the intellectual property you create. In Canada, when you create a drawing, you own it until there exists a document until you transfer the rights to someone else. So I, of course, always sign my work because it's an affirmation that I did it and I'm proud of it and so on. I did a series of books, and the first one that came out, they had taken my name off the cover. They digitally removed it, and I was quite upset about this, and I said, please don't do that again. So the second one, they did it, and I said, okay, that's the last time we worked together. But I kind of got even, because if you look right behind the ref, you'll see a guy with glasses cheering, and that's me. So I'm on the cover. So remember what I said about it being a show-off? I'm one of the few people with my mug on the cover of a Teen Titans comic, because I got really lazy and just took a photograph of me, changed the hair color, and gave myself freckles, and there I am. Also on the right, you see I did a series of 4 covers, The Legion of Superheroes, and I embedded a giant head right in the middle, but you couldn't see it until you bought all 4 issues and put them together. Surprised even my editor. I showed it to years later, and it's like, you didn't notice that? So, like I say, Harlan Ellison, who some of you may know as the writer of what's considered the most popular of the original Star Trek series, City on the Edge of Forever, was a dear friend and collaborated with him for years. This was the series that I did earlier that we later. This was it was an interesting work because we had 2 friends, this was in our college, who had converted to Catholicism, and this was myself and the co-author's way of trying to understand the nature of faith and why they had made those decisions. So, like I say, it's a space opera, but it's really an examination of faith and spirituality. This is my favorite book. This is Tempest Fugitive. Like I say, 200 pages of planes roaring through time. So it's a time-traveling aviator, so I could just have them in all these different eras. So it goes right from World War I up into the future. And this is a series that originally started out. Who remembers interactive multimedia, CD-ROMs? No. Ah, yes. Yeah, sorry, forgive me, but you're dating yourself if you remember CD-ROMs. So this is a series that I created when I was working for a multimedia company. And then later bought the rights from the company to do this series of comic books, which was great fun. It was also because at the time comics were getting like really dark and kind of mean-spirited, and that did not sit well with me. So I wanted to do something that went back to the kind of comics I read when I was a boy, that excuse me, were still exciting and chock-a-block with adventure and so on, but didn't fall prey to those kind of very dark, mean-spirited tropes that sadly have become, increasingly apparent in comics nowadays. And here's War Bears. So the genesis of this was that in 2017, the Globe and Mail published a series of short stories by Canadian authors about a period in Canadian history that they found enjoyable. And Margaret wrote this wonderful, wonderful piece called Ursinette. And it takes place over the course of like 15 or 20 minutes in a bar on VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. So the boys are coming home, the war is over, everyone is rejoicing except for one young man who is the artist and the creator of this character, Ursinette, who is a werebear, an indigenous werebear who punches out Nazis and helps the Allies win the war. So, a bit of Canadian history, there was a trade embargo in '43, and American goods, including comic books that were considered superfluous, were banned. And so what happened was overnight, 4 comic companies sprang up in Canada, one in Montreal, one in Vancouver, and 2 in Toronto. And they published comics for 2 years. And then on VE Day, the trade embargo was pulled. The American comics flooded back in, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and so on. And they wiped us out in 18 months. And it was 30 years before we started publishing comics in Canada again. So Margaret was always fascinated by this. She's always loved cartoons. She's a wonderful cartoonist herself. She's very funny. And she, again, came up with this story. I was tapped to do the illustration, and it would have ended there, except that any great work of art leaves you unsatisfied. I want to know what happened next. I want to know what happened before. I wanted to expand on it. So I pitched the idea to her. She agreed, and I wrote the story, and she was my editor. And it was just like the greatest collaboration ever. I'm eternally grateful for the opportunity to work with Margaret. So again, we'll be talking about this a bit more about Edutainment comics. Here's one about Betsy Coleman, who was the first woman of color to get a pilot's license back in the 20s. Mega Powers is trying to demystify physics for kids. So things like super strength would be considered in terms of levers and pulleys, and visibility, and X-ray vision in terms of optics and things like that. And of course, I assume it's the same here, but in BC, if you want to work in the food services industry, you have to take the Food Safe program. So when I first got it, it was like a telephone book, and it was like just tons of the most lugubrious doggerel you could possibly imagine, and some really lame charts and graphs. And I said, well, why don't we throw out half these words and replace them with comics? And they said, sure, good idea. So that's what we did. So that is the wonderful thing about visual storytelling, is greater comprehension, therefore retention, and in particular if the user, if their first language isn't English. And then also I've been doing a lot of work with the University of Victoria's Indigenous Law Department, working with local First Nations on Vancouver Island, dealing with water rights issues and application of Indigenous first orders in a contemporary context, and also working with organizations that advocate for disabled rights. And this is what I'm working on now and have been working on for years and years and years and years and years and years. It's funny, my wonderful wife Joan and I have very different working methodologies. We jokingly say that she's a tortoise and I'm a hare. Joan will plug away at something. She spent 11 years doing her graphic memoir, which is all about her struggles in high school, how meeting Marshall McLuhan's son Eric in college, who became her mentor, like changed her life, right up to the point that we started, she became a prophet when I was in college. But it took 11 years, because she just kind of picks away. Me, on the other hand, I wait until the last possible moment, and then I focus with a intensity that is like laser-like. and get it done. So this is not for everybody, especially not students. I mean, yeah. Okay, so that's all about me. So we're just going to switch over, and I'll talk a bit more about the specificity of tonight's talk. So bear with me for a moment, please. Relax. I want to say smoke 'em if you got 'em, but
This might be the wrong building for that.
yeah, I was just going to say.
That's the next one there, isn't it?
That's it.
We're good.
Alrighty. My voice is holding out. All right. So, the program that we created in comics and graphic novels, it was an 8-month program where the students learned everything. We created the program and the syllabus in such a way that the students would spend the first semester using traditional tools, the second semester using digital tools, and then they would publish a 24-page comic book that they would then sell at a little convention. So they got the opportunity to experience tabling at a convention, connecting with a live audience, and sell their work. So we taught about comic books, graphic novels, web comics, comic strips, storyboards, and edutainment comics, which is our topic for tonight. So it's funny because that comic I showed you earlier about my little public service comic about fighting litter, here we are at the Nova Scotia Department of Highways years later doing the anti-litter comics, which I think is a great pun. So edutainment takes many forms. Like I say, I did a lot of aviation journalism, and so, I love aviation writ large. So this is the Mars Flying Boat, which is this gigantic aircraft, which I volunteer at the BC Aviation Museum. You may have seen in the news that we just received this plane, is now part of our collection. And when it landed for the last time, it was accompanied by the Snowbirds, which was very moving after a career that lasted since 1947, I think. So it was a wonderful opportunity to stretch a bit. I've always tried to learn something from everything I do. So as you can see, this one is all done in pencil, which I'd never done a comic just in pencil before. So here's Mega Powers, where we see, in this case, I guess it was about transportation, how a jet engine works, how rockets work. More about lift and thrust and all that kind of stuff. And then here's what the comics I did for the company. It was English language learning for Japanese business people, which was great fun. And this was all done in black and white with digital color. It was fascinating too, because it was the first work I did where I never met the client. They were all in Japan, and everything was done online. I would send them the files. This is before Zoom calls and things. And this is the Bessie Coleman story that I collaborated with Trina Robbins, who is a wonderful author and historian. History is written by those who write history, and very often those who write history write people out of history. And Trina spent a great deal of her career acknowledging the contributions of women in the comics industry who had been ignored and written out. So to collaborate with her on a book like this was a wonderful experience. There's what the Space Place Gallery looks like. I'd like to go back there and see if anybody actually tried to scratch their initials in it. Actually, I kind of want to go back myself and scratch my initials in it. Yeah, I will. Okay. Shh. And as always, here's Ken, lower left-hand corner. There's Ken again. I mean, he shows up in all his comics. This was done for an ad agency that was trying to get Rogers as a client, and so they got me to do a 16-page comic that sort of explained why they should be getting, excuse me, Rogers business. Time lock I did for the Royal Alberta Museum, same with Blue Sky. And there's the Food Safe book again. So it's, again, imagine that this was originally just like big blocks of copy, like how to wash your hands and stuff. So the origin of excuse me, the origin of edutainment comics is Will Eisner, who is widely regarded as the kind of the godfather or midwife or whatever of the graphic novel. Back in the Korean War, servicemen would be given these gigantic binders full of instructions on how to, change the differential on a deuce and a half or something. So he created PS Magazine, which are these pamphlets that came with those manuals that sort of, in a very lighthearted way, explained some of the salient points of what was in the manual. And he created a character who was would walk the GIs through these steps. And it was so successful it carried on right up until about 10 years ago, I think. It was the last last few issues where you can see all the way through the Vietnam War, through Desert Storm and so on. They're still using PS. So comics have long, intentionally or otherwise, done edutainment comics. Here's Classics Illustrated from the 50s, all about the wonders of nuclear power and the atomic age and our friend the atom. Speaking of unintended consequences, here, see, I mean, it's like, see how friendly the story of electricity from amber to atoms, like ready kilowatts, like, oh boy, your house someday will be powered by like a chunk of plutonium the size of this chiclet. Sounds good to me. I mean, oh boy, that toast is really hot. Here's one about, what's it called? Civil defense. All about the wonders of steel. So a lot of these comics were produced by manufacturers and corporations and given out in schools or handed out when people would tour various factories and things. How to shoot, where there's smoke, which is how to smoke, or how to not smoke. And the true story of Smokey the Bear. I had no idea that there actually was a true Smokey the Bear who wore the hat and had a shovel and fought fires and things. It's like, who knew? See how educational these are. This one's kind of hilarious. I have this because my wife's name is Joan and my name is Ken, so it was just an incredible coincidence that the characters named Joan and Ken, and their marriage was on the rocks. It was because they hadn't ever heard of contraception, which is a very delicate subject when this comic came out. So he gets Ken gets so wound up. He's working at drill press and he punches a hole in his hand or something and goes to the doctor and explains what's going on. The doctor says, "Well, there actually are ways of." Anyway, it goes on and on like that. Also, propaganda comics. The communist threat. The absolutely, vicious anti-Semitic protocols of the Elders of Zion that Will Eisner illustrated. And we often see characters are co-opted, or rather licensed, in order to further the agenda of the publisher. In this case, talking about careers. So we can imagine Popeye. I love this communication media careers Popeye. Going, nobody can understand what he says, but he's in communications and so on. And fine arts and humanities, and of course I love artists always have like berets and smocks on. And then this one's great. It's like we start the agribusiness with natural resources, and then we clean up the mess afterwards because of like stuff like, like DDT and PFAS and so on. So I think you have to buy those two together. And investigating the scientific method, adventures in synthetic biology. Well, there's a bestseller. It gets better. Hang on. How about the Manga Guide to Relativity and Statistics? Adorable, kawaii characters telling all about statistics. Or how about pain is optional for office workers? I always thought pain was mandatory for office workers. That's why I never worked in an office. I said, ooh. And WorkSafe is the same as FoodSafe, except it's for construction workers. And then stories like The Long Road Home, which is G.B. Trudeau's book about the recovery of veterans of the Iraq wars, suffering from, well, amputations, PTSD, and so on. Kate Beaton's wonderfully hilarious, very skewed look at history. She was a history major and was bored stiff the way she was being taught history. So she started doing goofy cartoons about it, and they are hysterical. If you get a chance to read them, they're the best. Moonshot's about Apollo 12. And then here we are, 9/11. These are two publishers' responses to the 9/11 attacks. Strip AIDS USA was about the AIDS epidemic. At the time, I contributed to that book. Dignity and Respect is the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which has since changed. My wife Joan is currently working on a book about the Purge, a rather troubling part of our history, where in the early to mid 70s, gay soldiers were being purged from the military, and her sister was one of them. Her sister became a spokesman and activist for LGBTQ2+ rights. And it's only very recently that this wrong has been acknowledged and addressed, and Joan is, like I say, working on a graphic novel that explores that. So again, more biographies: Nellie McClung, Louis Riel, Feynman, and it's gone out of my head, another great physicist. Billy Bishop. The Kafka one is by Robert Crumb. So anybody who remembers Underground Comics, you can imagine. Robert Crumb and Kafka. It is the most depressing graphic novel you'll ever read. And then Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which is essentially a transcription of his father's experiences during the Holocaust. And then Harvey Picar's Our Cancer Year, which is self-explanatory. Marjane Satrapi, also autobiographic about her escape from Iran during the revolution, and then when she went back and how her life had changed. Guy Delisle, who is an animator who travels to, he's done a book about, working in Israel, working in North Korea, just all the countries that he goes to work, he will do a graphic memoir about those experiences. And Scott Chandler's Two Generals, about his great uncle and his service during the Second World War. Raymond Briggs, a very, very touching and in many ways heartbreaking story about his parents. An autobiographic work, an incredibly intense autobiographic work about Keiji Nakazawa's, who actually experienced firsthand the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, and then Yoshiro Tatsumi's experience of becoming a mangaka or a comic book artist in Japan. So, and all kinds of light things. Lucy Knisley's, who loves to cook, did this fabulous book about the joy of cooking done as a comic. Laurie Sandel's story about how she discovered that her dad was not who he said he was, or maybe he was, or maybe he wasn't. It sort of goes back and forth. It's really fascinating. Kyle Baker is a wonderful cartoonist who just talks about all the goofy things happening with his family. Eddie Campbell's Alec, How to Be an Artist is, firsthand look at the trials and tribulations of being a freelance artist, which I know only too well. And Will Eisner, that's his experience as a young comic book artist back during the 30s and 40s. Bus Griffith, I love this. I just discovered this not that long ago. It was a guy who was a logger back in the 50s and 60s and then decided he was going to do a graphic novel about logging when nobody was doing graphic novels. And it's fascinating because the intimate knowledge of the technologies and you know, the steam donkeys and things used to pull the logs off the mountains and so on. It is documented in the most exquisite detail imaginable. But he wanted to make it entertaining. So of course he had to have, you know, our hero, the logger, and he's up there in the mountain, and he's kind of lonely, and he comes into town, and the boss's daughter shows up, and she's going to work in the kitchen, and of course they sort of have eyes for each other. And so you get this really sweet little love story interwoven with, you know, the guys going up on the mountain. It's marvelous. So here's some of the students' work I was telling about. So their assignment was to do I think it was a 6-page edutainment comic about something that interested them. So this is Karen Gilmore, and her edutainment comic was about learning to ride. And I used to scuba dive, and Joan used to do horse jumping, whatever that's called. So every Saturday morning, we would bid each other a fond farewell, not sure if we would see each other again, because Joan was convinced I'd be eaten by a killer whale, and I was convinced she'd be thrown off the horse and trampled to death, but it worked out well. So this one is about learning to play piano, how to have a nice light touch and stay kind of loose and wibbly. Don't be too heavy-handed on the keyboard. I love this one. How to make French bread, which is just absolutely adorable. And the fun thing is, of course, you can anthropomorphize, like, you know, your characters. You can make your bread come alive, or the yeast, or whatever. We were often asked if you have to draw well to get in the program. We said no, because, you know, those drawing skills will improve. But the thing is that visual storytelling is a wonderful synergy that's created when words and pictures collide. So it really is about making words and pictures work together to tell a story. And, you know, the drawings can be very simple as long as that narrative comes through. This one is great. This is one of our students who actually was a dealer in a casino for years. So this is like all this stuff I didn't know a thing about. I mean, and that's the wonderful thing is, you know, you take subjects that you know nothing about, and all of a sudden I read this 6-page comic, and I want to go and start gambling because I know all the secrets. The biggest secret, of course, being that the house always wins. Forget it. You're never going to beat the house. Yeah, see? That's the coda right there. The odds are never in your favor. So here's a comment about statistics, making statistics interesting. And then this one is about AI and how it's going to impact us. And remember, this was done back around 2018, I guess, before AI had really started to impact in the same way that we're seeing it today. But like I say, this is all the work of our students in their final projects. So again, the most recent things, these are the most recent things that I've been doing. On the left is Aurora Borealis, which is Joan's graphic memoir, which won Best Graphic Novel of 2019. And on the right is the work that I've been working on, which is an exploration of the invisible subculture of military brats. We know each other, we have shared experience, we have secret handshakes, and all that kind of stuff. Originally, it was going to be a straight autobiography, but I wanted to expand on the narrative and tell a lot more stories. So I've been spending a lot of time interviewing and talking to other brats, both those who embraced that nomadic life and those who sadly were damaged by it. We were actually, in many ways, we were conscripted in the military. We had no choice. You know, our parents joined up to serve, my dad's to serve king and country. Nowadays, you know, but the kids, that was our life, whether we liked it or not. And when we turned 18, we were no longer dependents, and we were just kind of dropped on Civvy Street and told to get on with life. And there were consequences. So these are the things that I'm trying to examine. So the most recent thing I did, which you may have seen, as a two-page spread in the Globe and Mail about 3 weeks ago, where I argue that what we need, and the sound you hear is my dad, the fighter pilot, spinning in his grave. What we need are less fighter planes and more water bombers. And the coolest thing is the CO-415 water bomber, that lovely yellow and red plane, was actually built right here in North Bay. It was designed and built in Canada. It's the only purpose-built dedicated water bomber in existence. We built 100 of them. We sold 50. And the point I try to make is that during World War II, in Malton, we were cranking out a Lancaster bomber every day. We could be cranking these things out every day, and heaven knows the world needs more water bombers. I mean, you know, wildfires are having a devastating impact on our economies and our communities. So this is, you know, just my argument. And there's a bit of history there where, you know, I talk about, most Canadians don't know that we had the first jet-powered airliner. It flew weeks after the Comet and years before the 707. It was canceled because the Korean War happened. So our Minister of Industry, C.D. Howe, decided we needed fighter planes, and so we built the CF-100, the Canuck, that there are two examples here in North Bay. And then we built the Avro Aero, which my dad would have flown. It's the most magnificent aircraft, probably the greatest high-altitude interceptor, supersonic interceptor. But then, almost on the day that its first test flight, Sputnik was launched, and Sputnik ushered in the high frontier. So the era, conventional wisdom was that the era of the manned interceptor was over. It was canceled, but a few years later we bought used planes from the Yanks, including Voodoos, Starfighters, and later the Hornet. So now we're faced with the prospect of buying more American aircraft, or ideally, Swedish aircraft, which would be built here. So I'm hoping that's what they do, and buy less and use the savings to buy lots more water bombers. So I haven't heard back from Mark Carney yet. I'm hoping he read it, and he'll be calling any day now and say, that's a great idea. So there we go. That's Edutainment Comics, educational comics, entertaining comics in service of education, instruction, and advocacy. Any questions? Must have done a really good job. So I'm gonna go back up front.
I will bring the microphone to anyone who has a question.
Oh, surely. Even what's your favorite color, or just, and why?
Well, I'll ask one to break the ice. Somewhat unrelated to what you're talking about, but I'd like your take on, well, as you know, in Alberta, there's a decision to remove some books from classrooms, and it seems like sequential art or comic books are low-hanging fruit. Is there something particularly dangerous about images that are not, that words don't convey, or is it just simply low-hanging fruit?
I would say absolutely, because images there's an immediacy to imagery that doesn't, you know, it takes a lot more effort to like sit down and read something and kind of parse the words and what is being talked about. But an image is right there. And unfortunately, that's the upside. The downside is also that those forces that seek to, you know, marginalize those kind of images can make the argument that, you know, this is something which is does not align with community standards and so on. So as you say, it is the low-hanging fruit in that way. But I think it's very important that we all, as communities, we all push back hard against those forces that seek to, you know, dictate to us what we can see and what we can read and what we can experience. Because there's always an agenda behind those things. So yeah, I encourage you, support your local library, support, you know, bringing books into schools. And anyway, thank you. Yes, you have a question over here. I know you.
Who's your favorite self-created character?
Self-created, you mean?
Like you made it.
Oh, I made. Oh, yes. Oh my gosh. That's a tough one. Margaret created Ursinette, that werebear that you saw, but I kind of developed the character because there was no visualization until I did the drawing. She just talked about this young guy creates a werebear. So it was up to me to decide what she looked like. So I still co-created it using Margaret's prompt. But yeah, designing her costume and everything, and the fact that she was, a weird polar bear, so she has like very fine white fur and fangs, and I really love drawing that character. I'm so hoping that someday I'll go to a convention, somebody will be cosplaying as Ursinette. That'd be the best. I hope so. Thank you.
What age were you when you started drawing comics?
Comics are drawing. I've always drawn, and I think, like I say, all of us do. I think as soon as we can hold a pencil, we start making marks and things and drawing things. But, gee whiz. Probably about 6 or 7 would have been when I first started trying to put pictures together. My dad joined the Air Force in '43. He got out in '45. He was 18 when he got in. He got out. He tried all kinds of things and realized that what he really wanted to do with his life was to punch holes in the clouds, as he always said. So he got back in and became a career fighter pilot. While he was out, he started an import business with his brother, which was a disaster. But he had all this stuff left over from the company, and the company was called Ingleside Arts, and it was called Ingleside Arts because my grandmother's cottage on the Ottawa River, which she built 100 years ago, was called Ingleside. So growing up, I had access to stacks of invoice pads, which I would just turn over and draw on the backs of them. So I had lots and lots and lots of paper. It's not like today when you can go to Staples and buy 500 sheets of paper for like $5 or something. So I was really blessed that way, that I had all this ready, paper and stuff. So I just drew all the time, just because I couldn't not, yeah, good on you. I couldn't not draw. I was one of those people. That's really good to hear. So I think it's the same with, I've said this, to groups before. We hear the word talent, and I think it's, in some ways, talent is a bit of a misnomer. I don't, strictly speaking, believe in talent. I believe in passion and hard work. Talent, I think, is just sort of like an avocation, or it's a way of expressing something that moves us, that touches our hearts. But it's also that people will often say, oh, I can't draw a straight line. And my response to that is, well, that's easy. There's a thing called a ruler, and but who cares about straight lines? Unless you're an architect. And then they're really important. So it's kind of what I hope for people is that they will, whatever you can do that brings you joy, whether it's drawing or singing or dancing or whatever, you can do it. You can do this thing. For me, it was just drawing and then eventually writing and putting those two together and doing comics. And like I say, the sad thing is often people feel that because they don't have this ineffable thing called talent, that they don't do things which could bring them joy and they could share and it would give joy to other people as well. So I encourage people always, always, always. You don't have to show it to anybody. You don't have to tell anybody you do it. It's like singing in the shower. Nobody knows you do it, but eventually, hopefully, maybe you'll go to karaoke or something and share that. But whatever you can do that brings joy into your life, I really encourage you to do it. I was very blessed that, again, I was not dissuaded from doing what gave me joy, and I was able to turn that into a career. It's not easy. I mean, there's that 10,000 hours that it takes and so on. And I always like to say that I had a prof in college who said, we all have 10,000 bad drawings in us. The time to start getting them out is now. So I'm up to about 8,746, I think. So I'm still working through them, and I'm 70 years old, so I've still got a ways to go. So anyway, yeah, please, I encourage all of you. I believe in all of you. You can do the thing. Just do it. Another question? Yes.
You had mentioned just briefly about the Canadian whites.
Mm-hmm.
How do we save them? Because they've become a hot commodity south of the border. Because they call them
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because one of my dearest friends is Michael Hirsch, who in 1970, he got all excited about Canadian whites. He bought all the comics that Bell Studios had produced. He bought the originals and the reproduction rights. He renamed his studio Nelvana after Nelvana of the Northern Lights. They did a big show at the National Gallery in Ottawa, and he sold the originals, and that was what got Nelvana the studio rolling. And sad news, just today they announced that Nelvana is finally shutting down. It was sold and resold and resold and so on. So it's sort of the end of an era in a way. The good news is there's a wonderful academic named Ivan Kochmarek who lives in Hamilton who has done a huge book on the Bell Studios and Captain Canuck and Nelvana and Johnny Canuck rather, and all these characters. And he is working on another project which will be reprinting a lot of these comics. So they're in good hands, and reproductions are starting to happen. So yeah. Yeah, it's true, and we need more education that way. Just a brief aside, one of the things I find kind of sad about comics collecting is that they have become commodified to the point where people will take a comic, they will have it graded, and it will be then slabbed, where it will be encased forever in lucite with a thing that says this is a 9.6, and therefore it's worth $10,000, and a 9.5 is only worth $5,000. It's just, I don't know. So it becomes a thing, and you'll never read it. Now, the good news is that all those old comics, every comic ever published practically has been reprinted. So if you just want to read the comics and enjoy, the characters, you can get inexpensive copies. But the actual original ones, they have reached the most absurd stratospheric heights. I mean, Superman #1, Detective 27, first appearance of Batman, are like millions of dollars. It's absurd. That even said, you can still find dollar bins at comic shops and conventions where you can breathe in that wonderful oxidizing paper smell that's just, it's great, I love it. It smells like somebody's basement, Yeah. Yes.
It's working. I'm afraid it's going to make a loud noise. Thank you so much, Ken. Katrina Srigley, I'm a member of the History Department, and we're really honored to have you with us this week. I know you've been touring around and doing lots in the city, so I think that's fabulous. And I know my dear friend and colleague, Anne Clendinning, would have loved this talk. She was a scholar of Victorian Britain, and particularly material culture and the World's Fair, and she loved to vintage shop, and she would have really appreciated your last comments about the smell of oxidized paper. So I just wanted to mention Anne and how much she would have enjoyed this talk. My question is related to your work with Indigenous communities in BC. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about those relationships, how they developed, whether there was a different approach to storytelling that you took as a result of that work that's different from the other comics.
Yes, very much so. And so what happened was a friend who was actually the next door neighbor of Dr. Val Napoleon, who's the woman who was the co-creator of the Indigenous Law Department at University of Victoria. He was actually, he's a writer and an actor and a voice actor. He was the voice of Wicket, the Ewok, which is his claim to fame. So when we go do signings, he's got more people want to get Wicket's signature than mine. Drives me crazy. Anyway, he had been talking to Val about ways that Indigenous communities, and especially because they were just starting the law department, ways of communicating the importance and the validity of Indigenous legal orders in a contemporary context. And showed Val some of my work, and we got together, and one thing led to another, and we came up with a project where the first comic we did was Micamoses and the Wetico, which is about an incident where an Indigenous hunter is tried by colonial courts, and they come up with one outcome, and then is retried by a contemporary Indigenous court, which brings to bear those legal orders in a contemporary context, and of course a very, very different outcome is achieved. So we did that one, and then we were approached by the Couch and Band Council to do a comic about the water rights issues that they have with their watershed and how important it's been for like millennia in terms of well, fishing and hunting and gathering, all these things. But since colonization, there has been like all kinds of very negative impacts of that watershed, and also how to communicate to youth the importance of the concept of natsamat, but the concept of working together as communities in partnership in order to put in place best practices in order to further the needs of not just the nation, but also of all the other stakeholders on the island. And then the third one was I was approached by an organization called Surrounded by Cedar, which is a group that advocates on behalf of Indigenous youth at risk. And they crowdsource with their clients, young people, a story about a young Indigenous woman's coming of age ceremony, which is a beautiful, beautiful story. I was able to collaborate with an old friend who is Hawaiian, who has told me many stories about the issues that the Hawaiians, First Nations have had to deal with. I didn't realize that there were a lot of Hawaiians that actually come over to BC. There were like large communities there were brought over in the 19th century to work. So that was lovely. One of the most moving experiences I've ever had was I was invited to a blanketing ceremony and was honored by the organization for the work that I did. So I'm hoping to further that work. We have it's early days, but there are things that we're working on at the college that I'm so very excited about. I'm at the point in my career right now where when Joan and I started the program at Camosun, it was really, we had so wanted to give back. We had so wanted to bring the next generation forward and share the tools that we had worked with. And now to apply those tools to things that are very important to us as Canadians. That's what I'm going to spend the rest of my career doing. Yes? The shirt is actually, there's a wonderful graphic designer named Shag who does these kind of things. And I always say, like, when you're a cool cat, you got to look the part. So I wish. I mean, it's such a great design. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
I actually had a question. In this day and age, because I do writing personally, and in this day and age, I find that with AI and the political climate that we are currently in, that the age of comics specifically, because they originally were used to sell bonds and be like very anti-Nazi and teach kids about what was going on in Europe, that it's changing. And for you personally, some of the ones that you put up are very much politically charged, especially about anti-Semitism and the things that Jews have gone through in the past. What do you think, what's the biggest change that you have faced personally in your career with everything that's going on recently?
Because issues of censorship have always been, writ large in the comics industry, and of course the Comics Code Authority, which was created, I've always thought as a very cowardly response to the House Un-American Activities investigations into the insidious nature of communism and so on back in the 50s, and that comic books fostered juvenile delinquency and all this kind of nonsense, right? I mean, yeah, a lot of comics were they're pretty awful, but they were still done kind of tongue in cheek, but still it gave an opportunity for very hard conservative groups to actually organize, comic burnings and things back in the 50s. And so all the comic companies got together and said, look, this is going to be terrible for our business. We got to create some kind of overarching organization that will regulate the comics. And so they created the Comics Code Authority, which would look at every page and say, oh, no, that's a little too much, got to raise that décolletage a bit because we're seeing too much, or that violence is too, whatever. But little by little, it got challenged. It was actually Stan Lee who realized that there was in the 60s, that recreational drugs were having a fantastically negative impact on youth, who started doing comics about, Spider-Man, the Green Arrow and Green Lantern. They started doing comics about drug addiction. The social activism has always been writ large in comics, and it extends today. The difference being, though, that oh gosh, you're going to get me going now. So the problem I see with what has happened with comics turning into movies is it's a one-way street, right? The companies now that Disney owns everything, or Warner Brothers owns everything, is they treat comics like an intellectual property, like slush pile, and they reach in and they pull out, characters, and they put $1 billion in it and put a movie, and everybody goes to see it, and everybody goes, ooh, ah. But nobody goes to see the movie and then says, Fantastic Four, that was a comic book. I think I'll go and buy a comic book. I'll go to a comic shop. So it's a one-way street, which is really kind of sad because I'm going to make myself hugely unpopular, I'm sure, but I went to see Fantastic Four last night and was singularly unimpressed. And when I thought that when Stanley and Jack Kirby did those, because everybody said, oh, it really hews to the original canon, you're going to love it. No, it didn't. It was and I thought, what a wonderful story they had created in 4-color printing on crappy paper that just thrilled me as a kid. I still have those comics I bought off the newsstand. I can still look at them and go, wow, Galactus and the Silver Surfer and all this kind of stuff. And then I would look at it on the screen and it's like, ew, all I can see is these pixels. I just felt kind of like I was drowning in CGI. And there was no story. There was no real through line to the story and so on. And this is, to me, and I say, forgive me, I'm editorializing, but this is what's kind of missing in a lot of these movies. It's all spectacle, and because there's a generation, and I'm no judging, but there's a generation who's grown up on video games, and that is what they're, attenuated to, is seeing that kind of imagery. So, mainstream comics are dying. I'm old enough to remember if a book sold, I think 135,000 copies, it was canceled because it wasn't worth doing. Nowadays, the top-selling books barely break 100. A few will go a couple 100,000. So again, it's just, and because of the big change when they stop being sold in, supermarkets and corner stores and so on, you go to a comic shop, and to this, it is changing, but to this day, comic shops are still not very friendly to women, to kids. It's still, mostly, yeah. So that's a challenge, and there are stores that are broadening their appeal, but still it's a big challenge because the kind of work which is being published, and like I say, I just see it as being increasingly violent and mean-spirited, and just when I look at comics and every single drop of blood is lovingly rendered with specular highlights and reflections, and I think, really? I know how long it takes to draw this stuff, and you've got to dig it to do that. So I just, I don't have a lot in common with other artists who do this stuff, and which is why going to comic conventions is kind of weird sometimes, because you're sitting next to people who, I go, yikes. But the good news is that that's all changing. The opportunities now exist that because of, the intersection of two great technologies, digital printing and the internet, meant that you can now make comics every bit as good as the comics that we know and love, and you can self-publish, and you can go to shows like TCAF, the Toronto Comics Art Festival, which is all about comics as art and literature, right? So it's all independent creators doing their own comics. And of course, nobody's making any money doing this, but that's not why we do everything. I mean, a handful of people have gotten rich doing comics. Mike Mignola did Hellboy, Frank Miller did The Dark Knight. You can count them on the fingers of one hand, right? And everybody else is just a journeyman, like me. When I was working for Marvel and DC, I was getting a page rate, and I could sell my originals, but that was it. So I started looking for other, ways that I could do things which were satisfying and still made enough to keep the lights on. And that was a lot more important. And I was saying to the students, today, there are a lot of quotes come to mind. Frank Zappa famously said, "I can't imagine anything worse than waking up at 65 and realizing you've lived somebody else's life." And, that's why I encourage, everyone to do the thing that you want to do. And you will figure, it won't be easy, but you will figure out a way to make it work, and you will live a rich, full life. And you won't be worried about, your investments or your, whether you're keeping up with the Joneses and whether you can afford that second Ferrari or whatever. Sorry, I'm really going on. Was there a question here?
Mr. Steacy.
Hello? Wait, that voice.
I have a question for you.
Oh my gosh!
Is it true that you are the biggest Shad-Man fan who does not live in North Bay? Thank you. I do anything for a fan, so I'm here to see Mr. Steacy. Okay. So you're going to get a portrait of me. You're going to sit down. This will only take 2 or 3 hours, perhaps.
You know what? One or two is maybe we could bring those tables with prints and stuff, and I could sit there and I could draw you at the table.
Brilliant.
Let's do that.
Could we get a couple of helpers? There's some card tables, I understand, at the back of the room. This may, in fact, signal the end of the official program. I don't know if anyone wants to close things, and then it would be a matter of meeting with Mr. Steacy. And okay, here's one. Seek justice, resist evil, and stay in school. That's my motto.
Now that we have Shad-Man in the house, I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight. It was really lovely to share the space with people from across North Bay and Nipissing University. I really want to say thank you to my colleagues who stepped up for me because I wasn't feeling well, and I'm really lucky to where I live. I mean, I'm really lucky where I work because I love all my colleagues, and we work as a team. And to the students that helped be give directions for people coming in. And thank you very much, well, not Shad-Man, thank you very much to the church, to the church for hosting us here. That was really lovely, and thank you for this evening. So I'll leave it over to you, Shad-Man.